Thank you. In my presentation, I'll be speaking about Jews in Ethiopian Christian literature. I'm particularly interested in the word Ayhud and the related Ayhudawi. Who are the Ayhud? Are they to be identified with the Beta Israel, some other Jewish group? In my short time, I'll obviously not be able to sort out all the complexities with the Ayhud in Ethiopian Christian literature. I do, however, want to make a methodological intervention and suggest that Ethiopian studies would benefit by locating this conversation within the broader context of Christian anti-Jewish polemic. It's no exaggeration to say that the study of Christian anti-Jewish polemic has seen a revolution over the past quarter of a century. Following the publication of Marcel Simon's Veris Israel, scholars tended to see Christian anti-Jewish polemic as a reflection of a social reality in which Christians were in conflict with Jews. This conflict model interpreted negative rhetoric as proof of the existence of the other. More recent work, voiced most strongly perhaps by Miriam Taylor, has been more cautious in positing a social reality based on polemical rhetoric. In particular, a number of scholars have argued that some Christian texts construct an imagined Jew for a variety of purposes, but perhaps most often to negotiate internal issues of identity. Thus, at least some Christian anti-Jewish polemic does not have a real Jew standing behind it. I want to give a short example to illustrate what I mean by imagined Jew. On the slide, you see an English translation of the Syriac letter of the Jews to Emperor Marcion. As Lucas van Rompuy has observed, this letter undoubtedly presents an imagined Jew, a literary construction of a Miaphysite author who seeks to oppose the Council of Chalcedon. The Jews in the letter ask that their transgression be forgiven, since it was decided at Chalcedon that God had not been crucified, but only a human had been crucified. From the Miaphysite perspective, the Council of Chalcedon decreed that Christ was not fully God, and therefore that God had not been crucified. This Miaphysite sentiment is placed in the mouth of Jews for reasons that will become clear shortly. For now, however, I hope that you agree that it is obvious that we have an imagined Jew in this passage. That is, this letter was not written by a real Jewish community in Jerusalem. All scholars in the broader field of the history of Christianity, as well as late antique and medieval studies, are increasingly attuned to the possibility of imagined Jews. This is less the case for Ethiopian studies. Despite earlier interventions, including by Steve Kaplan, many scholars still tend to see Ayhud in Christian Ethiopic texts as referring to real Jews. This is, I think, problematic. Time does not permit a full discussion of the issue, so I want to illustrate with a single example, the Mesafa Milad by the influential 15th century ruler Zara Yaakov. This text deals extensively with Christology. In a few places, Zara Yaakov specifically mentions his opponents as the Stephanites. Could you do the next slide, Sabina? For those who have less familiarity with medieval Ethiopia, the Stephanites were critical of Zara Yaakov's innovative promotion of the cult of Mary. The Mesafa Milad finds its Zitzimleben in this controversy. While the Stephanites are explicitly named in the text a few times, Zara Yaakov far more often names his adversaries as Jews, as Ayhudawi. Consider, for instance, the passage on the slide. The esteemed Getachew Haile has drawn attention to this exact passage to argue that the Jews of Zara Yaakov's polemic should be distinguished from the Stephanites, since Zara Yaakov here accuses the former of not believing in the incarnation, whereas, and here I quote, the Stephanite, being Christian, did believe in this concept, but defined it differently, end of quote. While I have the utmost respect for Getachew Haile, I think that such an approach does not give enough weight to the long history of Christians mapping their adversaries onto Jews. A comparison with the Christological controversies of late antiquity is illuminating in this regard. In the aftermath of the Christological controversies, Miaphysites often polemically claimed that their Diophysite adversaries deny the divinity of Christ. In fact, that is exactly what we saw in the Syriac letter of the Jews to Emperor Marcion. Based on this logic, the Miaphysites, you can go back one, Sabina. Based on this logic, the Miaphysites furthermore, and this is important, they map the Diophysites onto Jews. That is, They call Diophysite Christology Jewish, and they label Diophysites as Jews. If we return to Zara Yaakov's Masafa Milad, it seems all but certain to me that it is a polemical treatise against the Stephanites, and that in many places Zara Yaakov maps the Stephanites onto Jews, just as was done many centuries earlier in the Christological controversies. If this is the case, then we're dealing here with an imagined Jew, and no attempt should be made to connect this imagined Jew to real Jews, and certainly not to the Beta Israel. More broadly, I become increasingly convinced that many of the Ayyahud in Ethiopian Christian literature are such imaginary Jews. This is not to say that real Jews are not to be found, but I think that each of the many Ethiopic texts in which Jews appear need to be analyzed anew, with an eye toward determining whether we are dealing with real or imagined Jews. And just stay on this slide, Zabina. If you're interested in more information about the theoretical background to these issues, I point you to the introduction to this edited volume, where my co-editor Simcha Gross and I discuss the mapping more extensively. So to this point, I've been quite pessimistic about what connections can be made between the depiction of Jews in Ethiopian Christian literature and real Jews, much less the Beta Israel. I want to conclude, however, on a more positivistic note with what I think is a real interaction between the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Christians. Following the work of Steve Kaplan and others, it's now widely accepted that Beta Israel literature in Ethiopic derives primarily, if not exclusively, from Ethiopian Christian literature. I want to illustrate with one example briefly, the Mota Aaron, or the Death of Aaron. This text is preserved in 2 Beta Israel manuscripts in the Feitlovich collection in Tel Aviv, one of which was edited by Wurmbrand in 1961. In his edition, as well as in a separately published article, Wurmbrand pointed out that the Beta Israel Death of Aaron ultimately goes back to a Syriac Christian homily by the 5th century poet Jacob of Saruk. Much has been made about the differences between the Syriac Christian original of this homily and the Beta Israel Ethiopic version, but there's some problems in the secondary literature, so I want to clarify just briefly. The Syriac original of Jacob's homily was translated into Arabic, where it survives in at least 2 text types. One of these was translated into Ethiopic. In his 2007 entry on the text in the Encyclopedia Ethiopica, Kaplan hypothesized that there must have been a Christian Ethiopic version, but at the time was not aware of any evidence for it. As it turns out, a Christian version is preserved in EMML 1939, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. This manuscript was digitized at the famous monastery of Haika Stephanos in the Wallo district, and it can be dated to the 14th or 15th century. The manuscript, which again I stress is of Christian provenance, is a source-oriented translation of the Arabic. On the slide, I illustrate with a short passage in which Aaron blesses his son Eleazar before receiving the priesthood. You don't have to follow all the details. What's important is that the Ethiopic closely follows its Arabic forlage. This is what's been misrepresented by previous scholars such as Wurmbrand and Phoenix. This is where it becomes very interesting. As I already mentioned, the Ethiopic version of Jacob of Saruk's homily is transmitted not only among Ethiopian Christians, but also among the Beta Israel, where it's found in 2 manuscripts. The earlier of these is Feitlovich Ethiopic 8, which attests a text very similar to that in the Christian transmission. The other Beta Israel manuscript, however, from the same collection, witnesses a different text type. This is manuscript Feitlovich Ethiopic 16. On the slide, you can see a comparison between the Christian version of the text in EMML 1939 and the later Beta Israel version of the text in Feitlovich Ethiopic 16. These 2 texts belong to the same translation, but as you can see, they deviate significantly. Some of these changes seem to be stylistic and or grammatical, such as the repetition of the verb, may he bless you in line 346. Other differences, however, are theologically motivated attempts to remove Christian language and imagery. Most obviously, note the omission of line 347, in which there's a reference to the son who will be born. Changes such as these are driven by an effort to make the text more suitable for a Beta Israel context. The transmission of Ethiopian Christian text to the Beta Israel is not new, and the changes that arose in this transmission process are also known, at least among specialists, even if there is more work to be done in this area. In fact, I think there's much more work to be done, and with several students, I'm currently editing the two major text types of the Ethiopic version of Jacob of Srup's homily on the death of Aaron. This project will study the differences between the two text types in detail, giving us new information about the transmission of Christian text to the Beta Israel. I want to spend my last couple moments sharing an example of the type of information we can expect to gain from such a project. This has to do with the actual point of transmission from the Christians to the Beta Israel. In particular, I'm interested in the manuscript folio that you see on the slide. This is a folio of the Ethiopic version of Jacob of Srup's homily on the death of Aaron from EMML 1939. Recall that this is the Christian manuscript, which was probably written in the 14th or 15th century. What interests me here is the erasure mark. Do you see it? What word do you think was here in the original? Since we have the Arabic forlog as well as the Syriac original, we all but certainly know what it was. The word Selassie, or Trinity. That is, the text originally read, "May the Trinity of Divinity, or the Divine Trinity, guard you day and night." I've read a lot of Ethiopic manuscripts, not to mention Christian Arabic and Syriac ones, and I've never seen the word Trinity erased in such a way in a Christian manuscript. How can we explain this? I'm now entering the realm of speculation, but this is what I would propose. I think that this manuscript, EMML 1939, is the very manuscript from which the Beta Israel version was copied. Let me repeat. I would propose that a Beta Israel scribe was copying Jacob's homily from this very Christian manuscript. In many cases, Beta Israel scribes adjusted Beta Israel texts to their new non-Christian context, as Dave Mueller illustrated earlier. But here we see a change to the Christian forlage. Recall that this manuscript was located in the Christian monastery of Stephanos when it was microfilmed in 1974, and it seems to have been there since it was copied in the 14th or 15th century, since it contains a land grant to the monastery from the previously mentioned Tsar Yaakov. If you accept my argument regarding the erasure of Selassie, how are we to imagine that a Beta Israel scribe accessed this manuscript? Did he copy it in the manuscript? Did he copy it in the monastery itself? Was the manuscript out on loan like a modern-day library? Seriously, how did it happen? Whatever scenario we imagine, I do not see how we escape the conclusion that here we have an all but certain point of contact between the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Christians. And with this, I'll conclude. Thank you.